Okay, so like I said, we're trying to finish up chapter 2 this week if we can. We might have some little shreds or something to carry over to next week, because it's always good to try to review where you left off in order to reorient yourself to hopefully where we're going. And so the goal here is to wrap up chapter 2 and then get on into chapter 3, which as I've looked over it, I'm like, wow, okay, it's more prophecy concerning the kingdoms, the beast kingdoms, and so forth. So hopefully we'll wrap up today with a better understanding of when the time of the Gentiles will be fulfilled. So let me pull this up from last night, because I'll have to toggle back and forth when I share my screen to do this review of the last 2 or 3 slides. And then I want to read to you out of the Mishnah. It wasn't in the Seder I thought it was. It was actually in Kodashim. And then in the tractate Menachot. And why that's important, or why that's interesting, is because we're trying to connect this vision that John would have had. I'm not sure what year, but probably, I don't know if this would have been just prior to the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, or would he have lived long enough to survive the destruction of the temple? That part I'm not quite sure of. I don't know that we have an accurate date as to when John recorded this particular vision that is the book of Revelation. But we know that the destruction on the mountains of Batar, which is this final verse that we're working with in Song of Songs, talks about my beloved turn, and it references the mountains of Batar. And so there's really only one location that we can connect with that particular verse. It's not a place like Mount Zion or Gilgal or anything like that geographically that we can point back to, and it's going to be used repetitively in scripture. It's something that's just going to appear out of nowhere in scripture. So in that sense, maybe it is easier to find. But what I wanted to connect from last night was what John prophesied in Revelation 14 about how the blood will run up to the horses' bridles. This had a preliminary fulfillment in either 133 or 135 AD. There's some discrepancy over the exact date, and it has to do, I think, with the difference between Jews and Christians dated things. But whether it's 133 AD or whether it's 135 AD, clearly it's going to be after John has passed away. And the historians who would record these details about the destruction on the mountains of Batar, which is actually the general location of the city of Batar. You're looking at the ruins, obviously, on the picture of the city of Batar, and then the general area there of Batar. They're associating the mountains of Batar with this particular location because of the massacre that happened there. And it was just exactly as John prophesied, which is the one surviving eyewitness said that at one point there was so much blood that the blood ran up to the Romans' horses' noses. And so one prophecy, one historical reference, they're not going to be linked by intention, right? Because the person who's going to be writing this has no reason to connect it with John's vision. In other words, he would probably have more reason not to. If he knew that this was recorded in John's Revelation, maybe he would have avoided giving this particular detail. Maybe he would have said, well, the blood was this high in the street, but he would probably have omitted the linking the blood up to the Romans' horses' noses to John's revelation of the blood up to the horses' bridles. Now, if this is a preliminary event, remember prophecy is telescoped. It's going to happen more than once, and it won't happen exactly the same as it did before, but the guideposts will be there of the prophecy. So with this particular prophecy that John prophesied, with this particular historical event that we see in 133 or 135 AD, both of these would have roots back in the verse that we're working with concerning the mountains of Batar. The problem that we have, what these two things are going to have in common, is John is going to be prophesying not only of a false Messiah. He's not only going to be prophesying of the beast and a false prophet and all these things, all these forces working together to achieve an end, but he's also going to be reminding us of the true Messiah, of Messiah Yeshua. So what was the problem here on the mountains of Batar and the city of Batar? The problem was a false Messiah named Bar Kokhba. And one of the great rabbis of post-temple Judaism, which of course is going to be Rabbi Akiva, he mistakenly identifies Bar Kokhba as the Messiah. He must have truly believed this was the guy. And as it turns out, he was just another human being, right? But you know, in that reference, if we think of these other false messiahs that did pop up, and then the true Messiah, you know, he's kind of concealed among the false messiahs of that era of the Roman occupation of Judea, because there were several false messiahs that rose up. And part of that has to do with understanding in the Jewish mindset, every generation is going to have a Messiah with a small m, like King Cyrus Koresh. He was called a Messiah. He was called an anointed one, but he wasn't the Messiah. And so in that sense, sometimes we get confused, like, you know, he was the false Messiah. Well, they tended toward that, not just a Messiah, small m, but the Messiah, big T, big M, right? So on the mountains of Batar, the city of Batar, he's going to be exposed as a false Messiah. And then John's prophecy, we see a fulfillment where the blood does run up to the horses' noses. But the idea here is we can look at this historical event, link it back to the Song of Songs, where it talks about the beloved turning on the mountains of Batar, this quick arrival from the mountains, and saying, okay, wait a minute, we could learn something from this. There was a misidentification of the Messiah. And so the beloved, we could have no expectation that he would turn, that his footsteps would arrive at that time, that the good news, that the redemption, that the lifting up of the head, that all these wonderful miracles could occur at that time in the mountains of Batar, because they had joined themselves to a false Messiah. So we can learn from that lesson. Huge failure, huge massacre, no excuse for it. There was no excuse for that kind of overkill. You know, decimating a civilian population in a military engagement, not okay. But nevertheless, and then last night, let me advance. I don't want to maximize it just yet because I'm going to have to toggle out of here to read Revelation 14. But here are the details I gave them last night. And I wanted you to notice how many times the 3 pops up here. The 3 pops up because I'm going to read you something out of the Mishnah that's going to sound very much like Revelation 14. It says, in this massacre of Batar, the last stand of the false Messiah, Bar Kokhba, it says the brains of 300 children were found upon one stone. 300 baskets of what remained of the tefillin. And again, remember the tefillin, they mark the hand and the forehead where the commandments are supposed to be. They were found in Batar, each and every one of which had the capacity to hold 3 measures or 3 seahs. If you should come to take all of them into account, you would find that they amounted to 300 measures. Now, at this point, you say, are they writing history? Are they recording history? Or are they teaching something within this text? Are we meant to take literally these numbers of things, or are they transmitting to the next generation something that will be difficult for an outsider to decode? And sometimes you'll find that in the rabbinic sources, when things seem really cryptic or strange, or like that seems impossible, or that's exaggerated, you have to understand that because Christians did burn their books for centuries and centuries and centuries, they found more cryptic ways to transmit information. The expectation was the rabbi would explain this to you orally. And even when it was finally written down, the rabbi would explain it to you orally. He would explain the symbolism of it and the story within the story. So in that sense, a lot of times we're grasping, trying to say, oh, the temptation, am I supposed to read this literally? Maybe not. Maybe you're supposed to see the symbolism within it. It says 500 schools were in Batar. Well, the smallest of them wasn't less than 300 children. See how they're repeating the 300, 3 measures. This is important. They used to say, if the enemy should ever come upon us with these styli, how they would do the vowel markings in the Torah scrolls, we'll go forth and stab them. But since iniquities had caused their fall, the enemy came and wrapped up each and every child in his own book and burnt them together, and no one remained except me. In other words, they're wrapping up children in the Torah scrolls and burning them together. All right, so yeah, that's pretty graphic. But we've just seen how they emphasized in the fall of Batar this number focused really on 3, which we know is a number of resurrection. Were they clinging to a belief that even though these people were mistaken about the Messiah, that nevertheless there would be a resurrection for them? I don't know. We don't know what they were thinking. We don't have that information. But in Revelation 14, we've got something I think is going to be interesting here. So let me toggle back out of that and into Revelation 14 again. All right, so let's skip down to Revelation 14:9. At this point, a third angel. That's why I had interest because they kept repeating some value of the number 3, some multiple of the number 3. Another angel, a third one, followed them, saying with a loud voice, if anyone worships the beast and his image and receives a mark on his forehead or on his hand, he will also drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is mixed in full strength in the cup of his anger, and he will be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. All right, the smoke of their torment ascends forever and ever. They have no rest day and night, those who worship the beast and his image, whoever receives the mark of his name. Right, but here's the perseverance of the saints who keep the commandments of God and their faith in Yeshua. At this point, John is saying, okay, you might have followed after something false, but for those who have the testimony of the true Messiah, of Yeshua and the commandments of God, that's their perseverance. That's what is going to distinguish them from those who take the mark of the beast. Now I'm going to flip down before I come back up. And because he's prophesying here, again, they will drink the wine of the wrath of God, which is mixed in full strength in the cup of his anger. Now, the cups of wine can be associated with Shabbat, but the wine of wrath, not so much. The cups of Pesach, you've got, redemption, you've got salvation and so forth. But that cup of Elijah is seen as a cup of wrath. That cup that's set for Elijah, that is seen as a cup of wrath that, should Elijah show up and lift up that cup, that the wrath of the Lamb would begin at that point, or would begin imminently. Possibly the tradition is within 3 days that Elijah will arrive 3 days before Messiah. And if we think of that 3-day resurrection timetable of Messiah, then it makes perfect sense, right? So, and of course, Elijah being translated, not dying the normal death, as kind of a picture of how your spirit, soul, and body could be maintained intact. He's the herald of this resurrection. But as we toggle down, because he's talking here about the wine of wrath, in Revelation 14:19, it says, the angel swung his sickle to the earth and gathered the clusters from the vine of the earth and threw them into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trampled outside the city, and blood came out from the winepress up to the horses' bridles for a distance of 1,600 stadia. So again, that's interesting to us because of, as we look at the feasts, we need to know what particular activities are associated with those feasts. You bring into the wine vat from Shavuot, which commemorates the giving of the Torah, right? And right here, this is what John talks about. Here's the perseverance of the righteous who keep the mitzvot of God. That marker would be Shavuot in terms of our feasts and their faith in Yeshua. All right, so in a sense, Pesach kind of marks the beginning of our faith in Yeshua. We accept him as a lamb, so forth, a good faith. We may not have heard all the commandments yet, but we understand that we can be delivered from Egypt, we can be delivered from the tribulations, and so we make this good faith statement, the blood on the doorpost, that I will go to Mount Sinai, I will hear the commandments, and then I will dwell in the tent and hear the rest of it. I will be perfected in obedience. Right? But at this point, he's talking about those who have worshiped a false Messiah. They've taken the mark of the beast. And now, once this sickle goes in and the clusters of the vine of the earth are reaped, and remember, the vine is associated with Israel. The vineyard is associated with Israel. So this is perhaps signaling that he's going to judge both the bad grapes within Israel, as well as the bad grapes of the earth. You know, remember, Sukkot is Sukkot of the nation. So there seems to be an extension at this point, not just the bad grapes within the vineyard of Israel, but the bad grapes of the earth. Okay, so now let's go back up here. And at this point, when this third angel comes out, he's predicting, of course, the grapes of wrath and drinking the wine of the grapes of wrath that later we find out runs up to the horses' bridles. That's why I say we can look back at this incident at Batar and say, John's also talking about that. He, in effect, had warned them. If they had had an ear to hear, he could have warned them, don't attach yourselves to this false Messiah, or you're going to get thrown into this great wine press, which is indeed literally what happened. The blood ran that high. And so here's kind of a tipping point for the righteous. It says, right in verse 13, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Yes, says the Spirit, so that they may rest from their labors, for their deeds follow with them. Right. So you see, in this wine press, deeds are being trampled out. They're not deeds of life. But for the righteous, there's a differentiation. They're holding on to the mitzvot of Shavuot and their testimony of Yeshua. And he says, these deeds can follow after them. They're blessed. Even if they die in the Lord, the deeds that go with them, those are good deeds. They will be part of their living because they're the blessed dead. They're not the dead, they're the blessed dead. There's a difference between the two. If you taste death, that's the dead. But those who stand with Yeshua will not taste death until they see the kingdom, right? These are the blessed dead. Their deeds can follow them because they're deeds of life. And then in 14, he says, I looked and behold a white cloud, and sitting on the cloud was one like a son of man, with a golden crown on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. Now, I think we can identify that as Yeshua. He's the Son of Man. And at this point, he's holding a sickle, a sharp one. Another angel came out of the temple. Right? And as we read this passage out of Kodashim, keep in the back of your mind that one of the principles of reaping the sheaves of barley for the first fruits of barley offering, they tried to do that as close to the temple as they possibly could. They wanted the grain heads to still be nice and green and moist. So unless it was a time of war, they didn't forage afar to go find those sheaves. Instead, the principle there is be quick to perform the mitzvah. And so they would find the barley fields as close to the temple as they possibly could to tie the sheaves off. And I'm going to read you that procedure. It says, another angel came out of the temple, calling out with a loud voice to him who sat on the cloud, put in your sickle and reap, for the hour to reap has come, because the harvest of the earth is ripe. Now, see up here, there's a prediction about those who are going to drink the wine of the wrath of God, mixed in full strength of his anger. It doesn't say it's happened yet. It's saying this is what will happen. But first, this is what 14 and 15 are telling us. First, the Son of Man is going to receive the message, put in your sickle and reap, for the hour to reap has come, because the harvest of the earth is ripe. Right? This is a particular kind of harvest. And it says, then he who sat on the cloud, and what are we going to be called up into? A cloud, right? It will be called up into Sukkot of glory, or clouds of glory. So the Son of Man puts in his sickle over the earth, and the earth was reaped. He brings those sheaves up into the cloud. And then another angel came out of the temple, which is in heaven, and he also had a sharp sickle. Now begins the judgment that John foresaw, the wine, the trampling out the wine of the wrath. So he also has a sharp sickle. Now that the Son of Man has reaped his harvest, it says another angel, the one who has the power over fire, came out from the altar. This kind of goes back to our lessons we've had on angels have a specific mission. They have a specific principality or a power, and that's their job. They don't do a lot of, multitasking. So this one who has power over fire came out from the altar, and he called with a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, saying, put in your sharp sickle and gather the clusters from the vine of the earth, because her grapes are ripe. Right? So the Son of Man, when he reaps, it's not telling us that these are vines or grapes. He's reaping, but it does not say vines or grapes. It's very specific right here. When we get into 14:18, when this angel comes out with the sharp sickle, once the Son of Man has harvested his harvest. And again, this is associated with the third angel, which would automatically make us think of the resurrection. The first fruits of the barley, the third feast. Now he says, put in your sharp sickle and gather the clusters from the vine of the earth, because her grapes are ripe. So the angel swung his sickle to the earth and gathered the vine of the earth and threw into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trampled outside the city, and blood came out from the winepress up to the horses' bridles for a distance of 1,600 stadia. Now I think we've got a chronology that's going to help us. Okay, now I'm going to pull this off. If you got your own Bible pulled up, that'd be great. Is a sickle the same as a pruning hook? No. A pruning hook is going to be much smaller because you're pruning like vines. Think of your pruning shears. Like, what's the job? A pruning hook is to prune something, not to harvest it. A sickle is going to be a big instrument or a big tool. All right, so I'm going to show you where I'm taking this from. And this is from the Mishnah. It's Seder Kodashim, volume 1b. If you like looking these things up, because the context is pretty incredible too, but you have to kind of be a Mishnah nerd to get into it. So I'm going to present to you what I think is relevant to Revelation 14 and the mountains of Batar. And then if you want to be the Mishnah nerd, please be my guest, because, you know, come on in my office. That's what I'll be reading too. Because this is where you find these gems. So it's going to be the Seder Kodashim, volume 1b, and the tractate. It's going to be from chapter 10, right? The tractate is Menachot. Menachot. You know what the mincha is? Do you remember what the mincha is from the sacrifices to the altar? Right, the grain offerings. Okay. And so this is dealing with grain offerings, menachot, grain offerings. And in this particular case, which it'll talk about other grain offerings like the Shavuot offering, which I think is linked to this. We just don't have the time to dig it out. But in chapter 10 here, and there's some other arguments, if you just go to it and read it, there's some points they're making with the Sadducees and the Boethians, I don't know how to pronounce that. They were kind of Jews, I guess you would call them, but they were always causing trouble. You know, they even factored into the Hanukkah story because they tried to entice Alexander the Great to wipe out the Jews and destroy the temple. So they're usually on the bad guy list. They've usually got wanted posters up in the first century. But it says there's going to be a discussion in here about when you reap the first fruits, and this is why it's an issue. Even today, we've got arguments over whether the first fruits of the barley is always going to fall on a Sunday after the Sabbath. You guys, some of you are like, yeah, we've had that come up at our congregation too. I'm not even going to get into whether that's right, wrong, up ways, down ways, or sideways. Not my issue. You can see it's a pretty old argument. If we're reading it out of the Mishnah, we're not the first ones who invented that problem. And so some of this is just kind of making the point that sometimes the first fruits of the barley will fall on a Sunday, just because if you're calculating out that day after the Sabbath, the Passover Sabbath, the high Sabbath, it could fall out on a Sunday. But in the Pharisee mindset, it's not always going to fall on a Sunday because they're calculating not after the weekly Sabbath, but after the high Sabbath of Passover. So it says here, on the Sabbath, it was reaped, the first fruits of the barley, by an individual with one sickle and in one basket. On a weekday, by 3, in 3 baskets with 3 sickles. Let's see. It says, ideally, the grain for the Omer should be brought from the source of proper grain nearest to Jerusalem. Because of the principle, we do not pass over mitzvot. We should perform a mitzvah as soon as the opportunity presents itself. Therefore, upon leaving Jerusalem to seek grain for the Omer, it was necessary to select the first such grain that was encountered. Okay, that's the principle. So that's why I thought it was interesting that he's coming out of the temple. Well, as you go out of the temple, what do? You seek the first valid fields of barley. Okay. At the close of the first day of Pesach, the inhabitants of all the nearby towns would assemble at the harvest site. And what would they do? They would wait till sundown, which is where we're going today. We're going to sundown and the night watches. And why did Yeshua say he might come in the second or even the third watch of the night, but he doesn't mention the first watch? This barley would be harvested in the first watch of the night, just as the sun goes down. As soon as it became dark, he would say to them, to all these witnesses who've gathered, has the sun set? And they would say, yes. Has the sun set? And they would say, yes. This sickle? And they would say, yes. This sickle? And they would say, yes. This basket? And they would say, yes. This basket? And they would say, yes. On the Sabbath, sometimes it's going to fall out on a Sabbath day, on a weekly Sabbath. See, according to the Pharisaic way of doing the feasts, it could fall out on a weekly Sabbath. And so he would say to them, this Sabbath, in other words, does the commandment of the Omer, of the barley, does it override the not harvesting on a Shabbat? Right? Because like, if you're going to offer sacrifices in the temple, you're going to have to offer some of them on Shabbat too, which because it's special, it overrides the typical don't kindle a fire on Shabbat. So he would say to them, this Sabbath, they would say, yes. This Sabbath, and they would say, yes. Shall I reap? And instead of saying yes, they would say to him, reap. Shall I reap? And they would say to him, reap. And the commentary says the shift from just yes, yes, yes to reap indicates hurry. We've been talking about hurrying the day, right? How he brings the day to us, how he shortens the time. So as you're reading these prophecies about the footsteps of Messiah, you get the idea, like the cool of the day in this verse that we're working with. That's when it seems like the day goes down really fast, even though it's just the earth's still moving at the same speed it always does. It just, perception is all of a sudden the sun just sank out of the sky. Not really. Our perception is because it was the end of the day. It did look like the sun was just sucked out of the sky. And so this is kind of the perception they're saying we're going to have in this time of trouble, in this half a times, times and half a times. Half a time, as the rabbis see it, they see the footsteps of Messiah as being the half a time, where our perception is like, that hourglass somebody suggested last night, where once you get down to the end, it just seems like it just whoosh. But really the sand's not running any faster, I don't think. It's just the perception, because the sand has run out. So if the times of the Gentiles is running out, once the end of the time of the Gentiles is down to the end, it might seem as though it's just like a vacuum sucking, us closer to this time of harvest. And the harvest we're reading about here is a good harvest. Right? This would be the harvest we would associate with the Son of Man and his sharp sickle sitting on a cloud. Right? He's got a crown. He's sitting on a cloud. That's all the information we need to know this is the good guy. This is the real Messiah, right? This is not Bar Kokhba. And so they say reap, and it says 3 times for each item. And they would say to him, yes, yes, yes. Why was all this necessary? And then it goes into why is the argument, is the Feast of the Barley, first fruits of the barley, going to always fall out on a Sunday, or is it actually calculated from the high Sabbath? Like I said, we don't want to get into this. But again, if it's falling out on a weekday, if it's not falling out on a Shabbat, then what did they say? You're going to have 3. You're going to have 3 men. So each of those 3 men will ask these questions. Has the sun set? Yes. Has the sun set? Yes. Has the sun set? Yes. This sickle? yes, this sickle, yes, this sickle, yes. You see all the threes that pop up? And I think this might account for the way that the historian recorded the slaughter of Batar. Because it seems to be that there's some realization here that this was not the good harvest. They followed a false Messiah. And so, yes, was this a fulfillment of prophecy? Yeah, but not a good one, right? So he couldn't turn on the mountains of Batar. He couldn't, because Bar Kokhba was not the Messiah. He couldn't turn quickly. He got slaughtered with the rest of them, right? And that's always the argument, you know, if people don't believe that Yeshua was the Messiah, they will believe that he was slaughtered and that he didn't rise again. Our testimony is that he did. That's what sets us apart. That's our three. Yes, yes, yes. Right? Reap, reap, reap. And that seems to be the message that this angel is getting. There's going to be two kinds of harvest. There's going to be a harvest of the first fruits. And see, if you go back up in that chapter 14, it's talking about the 144,000 being the first fruits who were purchased from among men. And so this process here, it's fascinating. They just go out in the field, and before they cut with the sickle, they go ahead and they tie it off. I think we did a lesson on this one time, how they'll tie it off with the red ribbon or the red thread. And so when they get ready to cut it, it's not random. They're very carefully managed sheaves, so they can just grasp the sheaf, and as the sickle goes in, the whole sheaf comes out, right? And if you do the traditional blessings after meals on Shabbat, you start off on Shabbat with Shir Hamalot. Shir Hamalot Shuv Adonai et Shivat Zion Hayinu Kichol Min Az Yimale Tzchok Pinu Ushonenu Rina Az Yomru Vagoyim Higdil Adonai Lasotim Ele. Okay, as you sing that, it's all about the sheaves. He who went out weeping, carrying his bag of seed, he's going to come back with a joyful song, bearing his sheaves with him. Well, that is a psalm of ascents. And as you read it in Hebrew, you'll keep hearing those words that mean to go up, right? So as a song of ascents, what is it saying? This Son of Man's sickle, that's the reaping that we want to be in. We want to be part of the barley harvest and be caught up together with him in the clouds. Because now we're getting this layering of the shofar, the shout of the shofar being, as he ascends to the throne of mercy, we want to ascend with him. And now we want to ascend from the field, the green, moist barley, close to the temple. You didn't forage way out there unless you had to. You get the fields. Why is the temple so important? Why is going to Jerusalem so important? It's saying, I want to be that fresh, moist, green barley. You know, I want to be one of those sheaves that are cut first, right? Even though you're still getting toasted when you come back in. But there's that sense of expediency, because it's going to take longer if you have to go way out there. You don't want to go look for barley on the Golan Heights. That'll take forever. Plus, it matures at a different rate, different climate, completely, different altitude. But you want those fields right around Jerusalem, as close to the temple as possible. All right, so we'll get back on track here, but I didn't want to point that out because I felt like it clarified where we were going about the mountains of Batar last night with this verse. And the caution that we're getting all through Revelation about these the false prophet, there's going to be anti-messiahs in every generation, true, but this gives us a pattern. And if it happened that way before, when people followed a false messiah, then it could certainly happen again. Okay. And it's very consistent, again, with what we're saying about the Feast of Trumpets as being a time when the understanding is, at this point, the righteous, we'll just make it simple, those who have the testimony of Yeshua and the commandments of God, those who know Yeshua and the fellowship of his suffering, because the story of Gideon is running all through here. I don't know if you're still holding that in your head somewhere. If you can multitask and hold Gideon's story in your head, you're reading the same story, really. That at the Feast of Trumpets, this is when, of course, we acknowledge his kingship, the fact that he's on the throne and so forth, even over repentance. We don't really work on the repentance aspect until after Rosh Hashanah. And then during that 10 days into Yom Kippur, these are deep days of repentance. The month of Elul is a call to repentance. But on this particular day, we acknowledge his kingship. Now we know why, because there's this movement. We want him to move from the throne of judgment, descend, hear the shout, be gathered to him. Like when that sickle goes in, he gathers his sheaves in. But you notice the process is they were already bound together in their field, which makes me think of the little flocks that the rabbis say will form during the footsteps, that they'll form these little flocks. And that's going to make it easy to just kind of grab us and come on, let's go. Let's go. I can't even imagine what that's going to look like, but I want to see it. At any rate, at that point, he ascends to the mercy seat. This is where we want our judgment to take place. Now, the rest of the world, if you have intermediates, if you have the lukewarms, this is really their wake-up call. If they have perceived the sound of the shofar and they know they're not right, they've got 10 days. And that's why for 10 days, you say, may your name be inscribed and sealed in the book of life, because it would be in question. If it's in question, you want to deal with it. You want to repent before the gates close at Yom Kippur. Now remember, you blow the shofar to release the Hebrew servants at the head of the year, Rosh Hashanah, Feast of Trumpets. But then we say, but then what happens? Nothing. For 10 days, nothing happens. The only thing they're expected to do is to feast for 10 days with their master. And for 10 days, they are to get used to the idea of being free people and having their own inheritance in the land. And so 10 days, it looks like they might be free, but they're not really acting free. They're still right where they were. When the great shofar sounds on Yom Kippur, at that point, they release and they go back to their inheritance in the land, which we know is not just the physical land. It's also talking about the Garden of Eden, that there's an inheritance. There's work to be done there on your own inheritance. Now, what about those where the gate closed? The decrees were set 10 days earlier on the Feast of Trumpets. The decrees were all sent out by the king, but they're not sealed until Yom Kippur. If nothing changed by the closing of the gates on Yom Kippur, then those decrees are sealed up. Still nothing happens. Nothing, no movement. The only movement you're really going to have is the movement of the righteous during these feast times and being put in those assigned places. But then the understanding is at the beginning of the Feast of Sukkot, then the angels begin to execute what is in those sealed decrees. They come unsealed. Each angel is going to get his job, right? And I think this is where it's talking about, okay, now this other angel comes out and he has a sharp sickle and he's going after the vines, because these vines represent Sukkot, when you bring in from the wine vat. Anything that's left over from the threshing floor, you can also bring that in. But these, the first fruits of it, you don't want to be the last fruits, right? Really, the fall feasts are for the last fruits, not the first fruits. Now they would still be considered part of the first fruits technically. If you bring it in at Sukkot, technically it can still be first fruits. But it tells you it ripened pretty late, or you delayed. Don't know what happened, didn't ripen, immature, or there was a delay. You weren't quick to perform the mitzvah. So you've got Sukkot imagery with this second angel, who is not the Son of Man. He just has a sharp sickle. And this is wrath. He's reaping out of the vineyard, but he's throwing it in to the wine vat, not for the joy of Sukkot. This is what the righteous will be enjoying as part of what has been decreed upon them. He says, your deeds follow with you. Your deeds are part of what's in that book. Not just your name in the book of life, but also your deeds are recorded. And he says, these deeds can follow you. These are good deeds. We can let these things into the kingdom. There's stuff that you cannot drag into the kingdom, right? You're going to have to get rid of that stuff. You're going to have to ditch it. And so that the idea is consistent with the timeline of what the rabbis are giving us about when do these execution of the decrees actually start in the earth. They start at Sukkot. And that's I think why we're seeing this angel emphasizing the clusters of grapes at this point. Okay, now we're back into this. Okay. Right, some other references to the city of, or the meaning of Batar or Batar. It depends on how you vowelize it, whether you're going to say Batar or Batar. But we know this is our expectation of where our beloved will turn quickly. This is where we're getting this idea of the shortening of the days. So you can see Batar, the city of Batar, where the massacre happened. And they say this has two meanings. It can mean the house of the blade if you vowel it one way. And of course, that's what happened there. They were destroyed by the Roman swords up to the horses' bridles. But here we have a contronym. You can also vowel it Beit Tor, which means the house of the turtle dove. And of course, the voice of the turtle dove is thought to be the voice of Messiah. So which is it going to be? Are we going to follow a false Messiah? It'll be the Beit Tar, the house of the blade. But if we follow the Messiah Yeshua, it's Beit Tor, or the house of the turtle dove. And strangely, our numbers are interesting because we've been looking at the half a time, the term of the tribulation, footsteps of my Messiah being seen as 7 years. But then the rabbis say for the righteous, the footsteps, the tribulation aspect of the footsteps will be half a time, or 3.5 years. And in this historical siege on Batar, it lasted 3.5 years. Now, was their time halved? Yeah, but not in a good way. It was halved, and then they went into a total slaughter, except for one person. And then that was the last stand of the Jews. Just like the fast of Gedaliah, right before Yom Kippur, that was before unless they went to Babylon, the Jews that were left in the land, that signals the time when they were completely dispersed into exile or killed. It was only those who went to Babylon and served their 70-year sentence that would be able to still have an identity. Same thing here at Batar. It's another total exile, because following that, Rome is not going to let them come back at all. If they come back at all, after this final slaughter by Rome up to the horses' noses, then it's going to have to be a miraculous one. And I think Isaiah 60 verse 8 kind of nails it. It says, who are these who fly like a cloud and like the doves to their lattices? Don't fall for a false Messiah. Listen for the voice of the turtle dove. Listen for the voice of the dove. The dove and the turtle dove, they're kind of equivalent expressions. But if he's the voice of the turtle dove, then he can actually call the doves back to their lattices. He can call them back to their feasts in Jerusalem, and they'll be flying like a cloud, because this is how the Son of Man appeared with his sickle on a cloud. Now, if you want more review on Batar, I found which lesson it was. It was Shir HaShirim lesson 39, which is quite a ways back. All right, so now we want to look at Luke 21. Yeshua is giving us a prophecy, right? So understanding how John sees a period where blood would flow up to the horses' bridles, we see one fulfillment, which we don't think is the ultimate fulfillment, but it did represent a time when people would fall for a false Messiah. But it was just the Jews who were destroyed, massacred, exiled. In John's prophecy, it's going to telescope all the way out to the nations, where there's going to be a worldwide destruction of those who follow a false Messiah. Okay, so we want to read Luke 21, but in your mind, keep that pattern there, that there might be a first destruction. That's the pattern we have there at Batar or Bator, and then a second fulfillment, when the true Messiah would return with the cloud. So now, I feel like I'm back and forth today. And what did I say? Luke. 21, okay. If you're wondering, I usually pull up NASB. I don't know if I want to read that whole thing or not. You're kind of familiar with some of the more apocalyptic thing. He's talking here about the temple and so forth. Then he talks about how one stone won't be left upon another. And then his disciples want to know, when will these things happen? What's going to be the sign when all this stuff takes place? And he said, see to it that you're not misled, for many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and the time is near. Do not go after them. When you hear of wars and revolts, don't be alarmed. These things must take place first, but the end will not follow immediately. He said, nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, massive earthquakes, plagues, famine, terrible sights, great signs in heaven. That's still not it. He says, before all these things, they will lay their hands on you, persecute you, turning you over to the synagogues and prisons, bringing you before kings and governors on account of my name. It will lead to an opportunity for your testimony. What is tribulation for? So you can give your testimony. He says, make up your minds not to prepare beforehand to defend yourself. I will provide you with eloquence and wisdom, which none of your adversaries will be able to oppose or refute. You will be betrayed even by parents, brothers, sisters, other relatives, and friends, and they will put some of you to death. And you will be hated by all people because of my name. And yet, not a hair of your head will perish. By endurance, you will gain your lives. Again, you don't taste death. If you maintain the testimony of Yeshua and the commandments of God, you don't taste death. Your body might die, but your soul is absolutely alive and held under the altar. He says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is near. Those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains, and those who are inside the city must leave, and those who are in the country must not enter the city, because these are days of punishment, so that all things which have been written will be fulfilled. Woe to those women who are pregnant, and to those who are nursing babies in those days, for there will be great distress upon the land and wrath to his people. And they will fall by the edge of the sword and will be led captive into all the nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. All right, so just some bullet points here to file away. Woe to those who are nursing babies in those days. And the Gentiles are going to trample underfoot Jerusalem. And there will be an appointed measure of time that they will be permitted to do that. Right? So, where did we go here? Down in 27, then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Okay, we already read that in Revelation 14. The Son of Man sitting on a cloud with a sickle. He's going to harvest his own. He says, when these things begin to take place, straighten up and lift up your heads because your redemption is drawing near. That takes us back to the psalm that we've been working with for the past week or so. He's going to lift up my head above my enemies. They're going to see it, right? They're going to see the Son of Man coming in a cloud. They're going to see him with his sickle, but he's harvesting his own. And this is when he says, lift up your heads, your redemption is drawing near. And of course, we've gone through the parable of the fig tree, right? Let's see. It was interesting too. He says, stay alert at all times, praying that you will have strength to escape all these things that are going to take place and to stand before the Son of Man. What does a omer do? Or what does the sheaf do? Remember, a sheaf stands. He says, now during the day he was teaching in the temple, but at evening he would go out and spend the night on the mountain that is called Olivet. And all the people would get up very early in the morning to come to him in the temple to listen to him. That's kind of a background of where I want to go next. Okay, what is it with these times that he's talking about? But as you read through that, you got the idea that Yeshua could be talking about two separate time periods. One, which has already been fulfilled. Of course, Jerusalem was destroyed. The Jews were exiled. And ultimately, even beyond the destruction of Jerusalem, was the final massacre in the city of Batar. Right? That would be one time period of the prophecy. But allow Yeshua in that chapter to speak to you through two time periods of the prophecy. One, he's saying, is going to result in an exile. But then he tries to tell you about the time of redemption. And it's okay if he's separating this into two different time periods, because now we're used to it. Now it doesn't bother us as much. Okay, so let's blow this up where we can see it. Oops. Oh, I didn't even have to pull that up. It was right here. But again, we want to look at the first part as something that will last until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. And he says it, an interesting turn of phrase here. He says, Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. It's the feet he's putting the highlight on, right? If we know the Empire of Rome is already past, then we know what is left of the Empire of Rome is mingled in its clay feet. And like we said last night, the Roman systems have infested every government on earth. We go to gymnasiums, we use Latin medical terms. The medical system we have handed down to us came down through Rome, before that Greece, before that Persia, before that Babylon. Everything has just been passed down, right? We have senators. Every system has been infested by these Roman methods of controlling large numbers of people so that it will serve this one government. But then there's a shift. Once the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled, once the world is no longer under their feet, then he shifts and he says there's going to be signs in the sun, the moon, and the stars, the roaring of the sea and the waves, which is the peoples, by the way. There's going to be great confusion, great anger. The powers of the heavens will be shaken. Why? Because those powers of the heavens have been given charge over kingdoms and nations, just like the Prince of Persia. That was his job. You take care of Persia, right? So these nations have their own principalities and powers, and these things are going to have to be all shaken up so that ultimately, when the Son of Man, when Yeshua returns, they are all working in concert with the will of heaven instead of working on behalf of their assigned territories. Because great destruction is about to come to their territories. And he says, then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power, great glory. And this, when you see this take place, straighten up, lift up your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. Why? Because he is going to lift up your heads above your enemies. He's going to draw you up into that cloud, which is just so cool. So what does he mean, the times of the Gentiles? It's actually explained in the Midrash. It's not a saying that Yeshua just kind of pulled out of thin air. There was already a background for understanding the times of the Gentiles. And their explanation of it, they derive partly from the verse, this last verse in Song of Songs that we've been working with it, which is Song of Songs 217, the mountains of Batar. They say the redemption will come only when the idolatrous kingdoms will have taken their portion, their Batar. See the play on word there? They will have taken their Batar of reward. Mountains can represent other nations as well. So when these kingdoms, when these other nations have taken their full portion of the reward, then the redemption will come. And this, again, it goes back to something we've talked about before. Even the wicked do some good in this world. And because we have a just God, he rewards that. And the idea is any good that they have done in this world will be rewarded in this world. And then when the end of life comes, there is no additional reward coming. They have taken their full reward. And then that concept carries over to nations, not just individuals. It carries over to nations, that there are nations who do some good, and therefore those nations will receive their portion of the reward of the grandeur before the coming of the Son of Man. Once he returns, that's the end. That's the fullness of the Gentiles. That's the end of the reward period for those kingdoms. That's the end of their autonomy, basically. And so they say it will come, the redemption will come, when the Roman kingdom will have taken its portion of the grandeur. The Holy One, blessed is he, said, even if I have no grievance against the Romans, except for what they did in the city of Batar, my judgment will be extended against them. In other words, once Rome has received its full reward, that will be the end of the time of the Gentiles. And you say, well, the Roman kingdom, the Roman Empire ended long ago. The empire we know as Rome was ended, but yet it extended into the feet and the toes and is with us to this day. Its feet are still planted on the earth. When Yeshua's feet are planted on the Mount of Olives, remember he would go at night and teach in the Mount of Olives. When his feet set down on the Mount of Olives, that tells you that the times of the Gentiles, the time of the final beast kingdom of Rome is over. And he said, if they had done nothing else wrong, except for the massacre in the city of Batar. He said, that's enough. That's enough for me to completely destroy them. Right? So the final destruction of the daughters of Rome, those mingled kingdoms of Rome, is the beginning of the kingdom of heaven on earth. That's the beginning of the redemption. But there's going to be the turnabout. What John sees, of course, is the turnabout. What the Romans did in the city of Batar is Jewish blood ran up to the horses' noses. What John sees is this end time fulfillment of the prophecy where the blood will run up to the horses' bridles. But it's going to be the idolatrous Gentiles instead of the Jews or Israel. It's going to be turnabout in the measure, by the measure with which they massacred the Jews in Batar. It's going to be measured back to them. Kind of bloody sounding. So I just did a little reminder graphic here that the kingdom, the empire of Rome, is not really done. It's still trampling underfoot, not just the Temple Mount. It's still trampling underfoot the rest of the nations. So not only is he going to destroy any control that they might have over the Temple Mount, he's going to destroy their control over the entire world. Because remember, that was the goal of the king of Babylon. He wanted to control the world. And why the feet? Well, what did the Romans do? They stopped the sacrifices. Greece did that before them. Babylon did it before them. It's just an ongoing process of stopping the sacrifices in the temple by these beast kingdoms. And so Rome is the last kingdom to put a stop to the sacrifice. Now we have a kingdom, we have a daughter of Rome at this point who is preventing any reinstatement of sacrifices, any rebuilding of the temple. But the last empire that can take credit for stopping the daily sacrifices is going to be Rome. That's going to be the last idolatrous, identifiable empire. But it hasn't stopped the daughters of Rome from also preventing the daily sacrifices and the rebuilding of the temple. So you can see that in the 2 feet, they're trampling underfoot and they've got 10 toes. And what's happening here? Well, remember the feasts, Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot, these are called the foot festivals because you had to go up to Jerusalem on foot. So they're foot festivals. What is the beast trying to do? He plants his feet on Mount Zion. The time will come when he will receive his Batar, his portion for any good he's done. And when that final measure of reward has been given to the daughters of Rome, then at that point, the times of the Gentiles are over. That's it. So this end of the 2 feet and toes of Rome with its daughters, that will be the end of the times of the Gentiles. Rome, do not try to isolate it into the workings of the papacy. That does not define it. There might be part of that system mingled in there, but there are multiple Roman systems that are used to control large numbers of people. So just trying to identify what the Pope is doing from day to day is not going to do it for you. All right, there's too many other dynamics going on. But once all these earthly rewards have been measured out to those kingdoms, the time is full. Messiah will return to Mount Zion from the north, or this hidden place, and he will crush these iron and clay feet that prevented Israel's head from being lifted into Zion. And so Yeshua says, when you see this, when you see them receiving their final reward, the end of their time has come, and your head is going to be lifted up. He actually says, straighten up. It takes you back to Yeshurun, which is like the straight one of the nicknames of Israel. He says, lift up your head, straighten up, because you're going up. Right. And I guess we could stop right here. I really thought we would finish today, but we still have some fragments left over in the basket, right? And they say this time corresponds to Zechariah 14:9. And they're quoting it in the Midrash Rabbah to Shir HaShirim 2:29. And they say this is what Zechariah is prophesying, that the time for the wicked kingdom, that is Rome, has come to be terminated. The time has come for the kingdom of heaven to be revealed to the entire world, as it is stated, Hashem will be king over all the land. On that day, Hashem will be one, and his name will be one. And so the image of the beast at this point will be completely fallen, destroyed, and crushed into pieces. Okay, so I guess for next week, because it is a kind of complicated relative to what we've been doing, we're going to review the hours. The 12 months is the hours, because Yeshua says at this particular hour, the hour has come. He's saying an appointed time of action has come. But we also need to factor in how the divisions of time are, not just in the daylight time of the temple service, how those are hours, even though they're not 60-minute hours. And then we're going to look at the 3 night watches, because Yeshua, as he's referring to the return of the Son of Man, he says the second or even the third. And so now that we kind of have the background of the harvesting of the first fruits of the barley in the first night watch, I think it's going to give us a really good sense of how the Passover might be functioning as maybe a first stage of the lifting of the head, a first stage of this rising up that Pharaoh commanded Moses and the people to do. He said, rise up and go and worship your God as you have said. There will be a preliminary rising, just like Yeshua. He arose, in this 3-day period of Pesach. So we want to review these hours, not just of temple hours, even review the months that correspond to the hours, the tribes that correspond to the hours, significant events that have happened in history in the hours, and then look at the night watches so that we've got a sense of both the day and the night. It's not random that the Gospels are telling us that Yeshua would go over to the Mount of Olives at night, or that he would begin teaching in the temple in the early morning hours. It's not going to be random when he says 2 people will be asleep in bed. One will be taken and one will be left. 2 people will be grinding at a mill. One will be taken, one will be left. 2 people in a field, one will be taken, one will be left. These are particular sign markers about the watches of the night. Because, like I said, maybe if you weren't familiar, the barley harvest began after sundown. It began in the first watch of the night. So you have all this processing going on in the night hours. And so as we look at our redemption, it helps us to understand why so many times it's referred to as a time when we could be asleep, when the expectation is we would be asleep. And the signs that we will be given for these night watches will have particularly to do, not with things you see, because it's in the dark. You can't see that well in the dark. The signs that will be given for those night watches will be signs that you hear with the ear. And that's what Yeshua will tell them. This time will not come with signs to be observed. In other words, you won't be able to see them. But if you have ears to hear, you can hear the signs. I'm going to tell you what signs are. You can hear the signs and you'll know what time it is. And you will know what should have happened at that time. So it's pretty cool. I think we're just now getting to the cool part, but we're going to stop. We'll just save it for next week.